So, as always, we'll start with a look at how global energy commodities fared during the week. Brent is down slightly on Friday, but actually oil prices have been victim of headlines in the Middle East, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. And of course, this week we saw a US-backed strike on Iran. So that was interesting. What's going on there? There's going to be quite a lot of price swings because all of it is tied now to the geopolitics of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East, in Gaza. But WTI was up as at Friday close of business trading in the North American market. Natural gas down, demand there a bit subdued. It was down by 1.74%. And RBOB gasoline, of course, tracking Brent prices, was up by 2.70%. Let's look at the Nigeria stock markets now. As at the close of trading on Friday, the all share index closed up, slightly up, I would say, by 0.08%, closing at 67,176.58 points. Equity capitalization of 36.8, a modest fair amount of deals at 5.17 billion. Not a lot of deals happening on the market, just a little over 5,000. Subdued market activity from the NSE. But what else is happening all around the world? Let's take a look at Europe. Euro Stock 600 not faring well. Still concerns around inflation, concerns around what central banks may do with interest rates, but all the major indices were down. And actually a big pharmaceutical company in Paris did drag that Paris index down quite a bit. So Euro Stock 600 closing at almost 0.9 basis points as of Friday, and all the other major European indices also following suit. Wall Street. Let's take a look at Wall Street. Wall Street, perhaps a bit of a mixed picture. Dow, not so much, but S&P and NASDAQ were strong and bullish as at close of play. NASDAQ up by 1.01%. Now to my business top picks for the week. Well, good news for Nigeria, and God knows we needed that piece of good news, but a UK judge sitting in London has ruled that Nigeria won its case in the P&ID, that's the Process and Industrial Development gas company based in the British Virgin Islands, which had won a previous ruling of $6 billion against the Nigerian government. And actually, it ended up at $11 billion because of accruing interest on that damages bill. Nigeria eventually won that case. Interestingly, the judge also ruled that a lawyer, Shasore, Nigerian lawyer who had defended the Nigerian government previously in this case, ruled him as not corrupt and said that his support and defense of Nigeria in the case through the years had been sound and constant. So huge vindication for the lawyer Shasore, who was previously vilified by many observers and stakeholders. But good news there for Nigeria. What else is happening around the world? Qatar continues to consolidate its hold in the global gas market. It's announced yet another 27-year LNG supply deal. This time, 1 million metric tons per annum will be going to Italian national oil company Eni. It's going to be supplying that to the Tuscany port of Piombino from 2027. And actually what Qatar is doing, Qatar Energy being the biggest LNG exporter in the world, is mirroring a similar 27-year deal it signed with Shell in the Netherlands and Total Energies to supply a total of 3.6 million tons per annum of LNG. Good news there for those markets, but actually those deals will not come online till 2026 and 2027, which means Asia will still be the main recipient of LNG coming from Qatar. And of course, if you remember, sometime last year, at the end of last year, Qatar had locked in a 27-year supply contract with China. So LNG trading still happening, long-term contracts are back in the market. Bitcoin hits $35,000. Almost a one-year high, actually more than a one-year high. The last time we saw such highs for Bitcoin was 2022. Why did this happen? Major ruling that came out saying and allowing exchange-traded funds, Bitcoin exchange-traded funds, to come into the market. And what this essentially means is that because Bitcoin is volatile, its price is unpredictable, if you can invest in Bitcoin through an ETF, an exchange-traded fund, then you're less susceptible to volatility, and that might increase demand for Bitcoin. So we saw prices go to a $35,000 high. Interestingly, if you were shorting Bitcoin, sorry for you, that's obviously not a good outlook for you if you're shorting Bitcoin. What else? Kenya plans a 5% increase in its budget, which goes against what President William Ruto in Kenya had promised. They were actually promised some measure of austerity, but now they're looking at a 5% increase in their budget. Interestingly, this year, the Kenyan shillings is down 18% against the US dollar. They're also looking at potentially privatizing non-strategic national assets in Kenya. So really tight times for the Kenyan market, looking at ways to refinance and get more liquidity and credit in the Kenyan economy. But part of the money that will be increasing that budget figure will be going to repaying salaries, pensions, and other things, and refinancing potential government borrowings domestically. UK PM, my final story today on my business topics, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced the creation of an AI Safety Institute. Now, this is really big news because for a while, we've been talking about regulating AI and the double-edged sword that is AI. So UK regulators and the government have taken the first move. They already have been collecting data from AI technology companies, which they feel might pose a risk to future development of systems that they don't perceive as safe. So the UK this week in an AI conference announcing that, well, ahead of an AI conference this coming week, announcing that it had moved one step ahead the rest of the world to actually create a safety institute looking at the risks of AI. Hopefully that doesn't lead to a stunting of research and innovation in that space, but it hopefully helps us manage the risks a bit better. So we'll be following that development a bit more closely here on Business Week. Well, let's take a look at what else is happening around the world. Brussels is weighing options to prolong an emergency gas price cap introduced in February amid fears that the conflict in the Middle East and sabotage of a Baltic pipeline could push up prices again this winter. The European Commission said, and I quote, "There is no indication of negative effects since the measure had entered into force, and that gas prices were now almost 90% lower than last year," according to a presentation given to diplomats from the EU's 27 member states. Well, women in Iceland, including the country's prime minister, went on strike on Tuesday in protest of the country's gender pay gap. Organizers of the strike encouraged women and non-binary people to stop paid and unpaid work for a full day, including childcare, household chores, and other responsibilities related to the family or home. Thousands of women gathered in Anahol, a hill in the country's capital city of Reykjavik, and about a couple dozen other events were held around the country, such as the Dragsnes, Hafstangi, and Rufahofen. I hope I've done justice to those words. Women earn about 21% less than men, according to the organizers, and lower wages in Iceland are most distinct among immigrant women, women who work in sanitation and with children, disabled people, and the elderly. The European Central Bank left interest rates unchanged Thursday for the first time since July last year as inflation starts to slow and the Eurozone economic outlook darkens. The closely watched deposit rate was left at 4%, a record high. The bank had previously hiked rates 10 times in a row to tackle elevated inflation. As part of efforts to boost foreign currency liquidity in the economy and strengthening the FX, the federal government of Nigeria has concluded a plan to securitize about $7 billion of the country's dividends from the Nigerian liquefied natural gas company. A top official in the present administration who disclosed this to newspaper This Day on Thursday said while the government expects to get $7 billion from a consortium led by Standard Chartered Bank from next week, the government also expects inflows from the $3 billion emergency loan from the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, which the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited had secured 2 months ago, bringing the total inflows expected in the short term to $10 billion. The arrangement is being organized by the Federal Ministry of Finance Incorporated, which is the shareholder of the NLNG. Meanwhile, still in Nigeria, the President's Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform Committee has recommended that the government impose an excise tax on foreign exchange transactions done outside the official exchange rate market in a bid to curb multiple rates in Nigeria. This was as part of a list of 20 quick win recommendations made to the government. Committee Chair Taiwo Oyedele on his X handle stated that the proposals were intended to promote transparency, encourage ease of business transactions, and enforce a single exchange rate system in Nigeria. Transcorp Hotels plc, the hospitality subsidiary of Transcorp Group, has announced its financial performance for the third quarter of this year, showing a strong year-on-year growth on all indices. The leading hospitality brand sustained strong growth, recording 31.76% growth in revenue to 29.9 billion naira from 22.7 billion naira the previous year. Profit also grew by 62% to 5.5 billion naira from 3.4 billion naira previously. The results reflect the company's commitment to delivering exceptional value to its stakeholders and sustaining its growth momentum. China has announced a 1 trillion yuan sovereign bond issuance in a move experts say is an attempt to shore up the economy after a sluggish post-COVID recovery. The Central Bank of China will issue an additional 1 trillion yuan of 2023 treasury bonds in the fourth quarter of this year, and additional treasury bonds will be allocated to local governments to focus on supporting post-disaster recovery and reconstruction.